Okay, so good morning, everybody. My name is Steffy Bechelet. I'm the domestic abuse and brain injury researcher at Brainkind. Today, I'll be talking about our journey of raising awareness of brain injury symptoms in survivors accessing domestic abuse services in the UK. But just before I begin, I just want to give a reminder that domestic abuse affects millions of people, spanning all ages, identities, and professions, and there's a high likelihood that domestic abuse is in the room with us today. And what I mean by that is, it's highly likely that someone in this room, in our teams, and in our wider networks has been impacted directly or indirectly by domestic abuse. We might not know who those people are and they may never disclose it. So just to hold that in mind as we discuss this topic, thinking about brain injury in the context of domestic abuse and holding space with sensitivity, awareness and compassion. And as was mentioned just before, if you need to take time away from this presentation and come back to it, please do. Please keep yourself safe. So I just want to talk a little bit about Brainkind because I appreciate you might not know who we are. Brainkind is the largest national charity supporting people with brain injuries and other neurological conditions in the UK. We've got neurological hospitals, rehabilitation centres and supported living accommodation nationwide. We provide specialist person-centred care and rehabilitation to help people thrive after a brain injury or other neurological conditions, no matter what. We've got over 40 years of experience and we're committed to providing personalised and compassionate treatment and care. So as you can imagine, we're led by a team of clinical experts for the services that I've listed that focus on a really holistic approach to rehabilitation. We try to empower the people we support and their families. We use our experience with brain injuries to help shape government policies, change perceptions and improve lives. We also conduct research that helps identify unrecognised areas of need and contribute to developing and improving services and interventions. At Brainkind, we think that everyone with a brain injury, regardless of their circumstances, should have equal and easy access to the right services. So just as we begin, I want to give an overview of the definition of domestic abuse in the UK, because often when we talk about brain injury and domestic abuse, there's an assumption that we're only talking about intimate partner violence. But as you can see here from the definition that the UK government used in the Domestic Abuse Act, we're talking about any incident or pattern of incidents of controlling, coercive, threatening behaviour, violence or abuse between those aged 16 or over who are personally connected or have been. This includes intimate partners, family members, and is regardless of gender or sexuality. And just a little caveat at the bottom, we're not just talking about physical violence. This includes sexual violence, economic abuse, psychological and emotional abuse, violent or threatening behaviour, and controlling or coercive behaviour. So we're really talking about that umbrella term of experiences when we talk about domestic abuse. And what you may or may not know is about some of the prevalence of domestic abuse in the UK. So in the year ending March 2024, the Crime Survey for England and Wales estimated that 2.3 million people aged 16 and over experienced domestic abuse. And in the same time period, the police recorded over 850,000 domestic abuse related crimes in England and Wales. And this equates to a call to the police about domestic abuse every 30 seconds, making it one of the highest volume priority crimes in the UK. But what we also know is that domestic abuse is often referred to as a hidden crime, one that's not always reported to the police or other frontline services for various reasons. So therefore, when we look at this data and these numbers, we're only seeing a partial picture of the actual levels and types of domestic abuse that people are experiencing, and the actual number of incidents are likely to be far higher. What we also know is that domestic abuse disproportionately impacts women, but further disproportionately impacts people from minoritized groups, many of whom are already facing multiple disadvantages. So, for example, considering older people, people already living with a disability, people from minoritized backgrounds such as immigration status or race, and people who identify as LGBTQIA+. And I just want to talk now a little bit about the connection of domestic abuse and brain injuries. So, domestic abuse is one of the top causes of acquired brain injury in women around the world. And I'll break this sentence down a little bit. So, when we talk about domestic abuse, I'm referring to that government definition, that umbrella term that covers all those different types of domestic abuse. So, not just physical violence between intimate partners. And we know it's one of the top causes of acquired brain injury in people who experience domestic abuse, because unfortunately, when people experience physical violence, there's an incredibly high likelihood that they'll experience injuries to the head, neck, and face, including blunt force trauma or being suffocated or held in a way that they can't breathe. These are two potential mechanisms for brain injury. So when we talk about acquired brain injury, we're talking about both traumatic, so that blunt force trauma, or hypoxic or anoxic, which is to do with the deprivation of oxygen to the brain. So again, those two mechanisms. And we know that it's one of the top causes of acquired brain injury in women around the world because of the bulk of the international studies have focused on women as survivors and victims. Obviously, we completely acknowledge that anybody can be a survivor of domestic abuse, but we do acknowledge that it is overwhelmingly gendered and sex-based as a crime. And we know from global research that people who experience domestic abuse are likely to experience hits to the heads, as I said before. And a lot of international studies have marked this at around 40 to 92% of survivors. So, nearly half, if not significantly more, of all survivors have experienced head, neck, and face injuries, with half of all the survivors across those many, many studies internationally reporting experiences of strangulation. So what this tells us is that domestic abuse survivors are at an increased risk of experiencing both a traumatic or a hypoxic brain injury. Now, not every head injury will be a brain injury, but we know that physical violence in the context of domestic abuse seldom happens once. And the more that you experience these potential mechanisms for brain injury, the higher that risk becomes. And we know that women present differently with symptomology to men. For many women, their symptoms present as trauma and mental health-based symptoms, which potentially leads to a misattribution of those symptoms when they do seek medical help. And people who have experienced domestic abuse are most likely to experience a brain injury that presents as what we would call a hidden disability. So quite often when we think about brain injury, we think about people who might need our Brainkind services, for example, that need neurorehabilitation. They might need to learn to walk and talk again. We think of that quite severe end of the experiences of brain injury. But actually, there's a lot of brain injury that sits in what we call a mild to moderate brain injury space. And there's now increasing awareness across brain injury research that brain injury is classified as mild, and we normally say that in inverted commas, can have long-term cognitive, social, and emotional consequences for individuals that mean that they require support across their entire lifespan and not just the acute phase of the injury that they've experienced. So really speaking to that long-term impact of those injuries. So I just want to take you on a little bit of a journey as to how Brainkind, a brain injury organisation, got to talking about domestic abuse, conducting our research and developing resources in this space. So it began back in 2016. So you can see here, there's a screen grab from one of our research reports called Making the Link. So from 2016 to 2018, we piloted what we call the Brain Injury Link Worker Service in HMP Drake Hall. And we've got a significant background of working within the criminal justice system to understand the prevalence of brain injury in these spaces. But historically, before 2016, we had only been in the male estate. So we went to a female prison and we tried to explore the relevance of the brain injury link worker service and understand how likely it was that women within the prison at HMP Drake Hall may have experienced a brain injury. Domestic abuse was only one question on that form. It wasn't the focus of that research at all. But what we found was that 64% of the women that we spoke to were screening positive for a history indicative of a brain injury using a tool called the Busy. And the Busy is a tool that we devised as Brainkind to help understand the potential prevalence or lifetime history that suggests that someone might be living with a brain injury. So it's not a clinical tool, but it's incredibly useful in understanding the experiences people have had in terms of hits to the head, neck, and face, and losses of consciousness, and how likely that is, given their symptoms, to be presenting as a brain injury. So, as I say, 64% of the women in this study were screening positive for that history indicative of a brain injury. And more than half of those women attributed that to their experiences of domestic abuse, that they hadn't had those injuries before they had been experienced domestic abuse, and they hadn't experienced those symptoms prior to those domestic abuse experiences. So these findings became the start of Brainkind's work, focusing on linking the experiences of domestic abuse and the potential prevalences of brain injury. So we wanted to understand if this is what the numbers are like within the criminal justice system, and these are the experiences that women in particular are having. What is it like in the general population for people maybe accessing domestic abuse services that aren't accessing brain injury support or within the criminal justice system? So we convened a roundtable in 2019 with experts from the NHS, domestic abuse charities, from homelessness organisations, from substance use organisations, and brain injury specialists, because we really wanted to explore the understanding of brain injury amongst domestic abuse, people who work with domestic abuse survivors, what training people might have had, how they would support someone, and so on. And the resulting publication here, you can see the second screenshot, is Invisible Impact. We published this in 2021, and this really showed us that there were significant gaps in awareness, training, and policy for professionals. And this isn't anybody's fault. There hadn't been research looking at these areas, so therefore there hadn't been training or awareness packages created that professionals could go on and then better support individuals that they were working with. So this got us thinking, what about domestic abuse professionals, so IDVAs, ISFAs, project workers in refuges and safe accommodation settings, and so on. So we partnered with Safe Lives, who are a leading national UK domestic abuse organisation, and we conducted a national audit with them in 2021. And we spoke to over 100 domestic abuse practitioners, and we asked them, have you had any experience supporting someone with a brain injury? Would you know how to support someone with a brain injury? Would you know how to identify symptoms? And have you had any specific brain injury training? And unsurprisingly, more than 81% of the practitioners we spoke to had no training in brain injuries, with more than half feeling really unprepared to identify symptoms of brain injuries. So this really reinforced to us the need for further research to understand what is the prevalence of brain injury amongst survivors who are accessing these domestic abuse services, and how can we better support the professionals delivering those services to understand brain injuries and respond appropriately. So the next piece of research we did was in 2024, and this has been the main sort of launch point for a lot of our subsequent work and thinking. So in 2024, we led a research piece looking at the prevalence of brain injury in people who have experienced domestic abuse who are accessing community-based services that were specialist for domestic abuse. We spoke to 60 survivors in 9 different host sites across England and Wales. So many of these were safe accommodation settings, some of them were community-based IDFA settings, and so on. We spoke to a really wide range of participants in terms of age, 18 to 72, and we're really proud of that, because we know both within brain injury but also domestic abuse research, quite often the voices of people over 45 aren't heard. So we were really pleased to make sure that we got a broad range of ages. And then all of the participants who wanted to take part in the research identified as female women. And we didn't set out to do a female specific project, but this is because of the survivors who felt ready to talk and share their stories, and also the services that were able to support us to facilitate this research. Because one of the key things for participants, or the key criterion for participants to take part in our study, was they had to be actively supported by a domestic abuse service, so we can ensure that safeguarding was in place long after the interviews happened. And the interviews themselves, so data collection began in 2022. It took just over a year and a half to do all of the interviews. Many were face-to-face, but we also did some online. And the interview itself consisted of sitting down with me and exploring what someone's journey to accessing domestic abuse support would be, what it's looked like, how many times people have reached out for support, how many perpetrators, what type of abuse have they experienced. Then asking around around general demographic information. How do people identify? What is their lived experience? Asking people about any children and family services involvement, any criminal justice system involvement, so police, probation, courts, involvement with children's services, if they have any children, particularly under the age of 18, and also thinking about mental health and health interventions and outcomes, so thinking about self-harm, suicide, substance use, and then using those qualitative questions to really build a picture of someone's life and situating that alongside the results of 7 different screening measures that we use. So we screened for potential brain injury. As I said, we used the BUSY, so looking at that history indicative of brain injury. We looked at post-concussion symptoms, depression and low mood, anxiety, anger, and post-traumatic stress symptoms, because we really wanted to understand not just what people have experienced, but how they present, the symptoms that they struggle with, and so on, to really build a picture of what that looks like for them. And now, just before I show you the results of that, in the general population, it's estimated that 1 in 12 people might be living with a brain injury. Within the criminal justice system, those numbers change depending on the study that you look at, but they all go from about 1 in 6 to 1 in 8. And when we did this study, we found that 1 in 2 survivors were screening positive on the brain injury screening index, so significantly higher than within the general population. And unfortunately, this number does match international studies. So we're seeing a real universal thread of that high prevalence of potential brain injuries. 80% of the women in the study reported a serious blow to the head. And if we go back to the slide that we were on earlier, thinking about those different mechanisms for brain injury, the traumatic blows to the head, the serious blows to the head, that is one mechanism. Then we asked people, have you ever been held in a way that you felt that you couldn't breathe? And this is us asking about non-fatal strangulation and suffocation. But the reason that we worded it in this way is when we were devising our questions, we consulted with Safe Lives and a group of survivors. And they said, if you ask, have you been strangled, yes or no, a lot of people won't resonate that word with their experience. That's not how they describe it in their own terms. And they also might not answer because they feel uncomfortable with that question. But if you ask people, have you ever been held in a way that you felt that you couldn't breathe? And if people say yes, invite people to describe that in their own terms. So that's what we did. So 75% of the women that we spoke to said that they had been held in a way that they felt that they couldn't breathe on at least one occasion. And then when we analysed when people had said yes, the answers they gave us after the interviews, 46% of the people that we spoke with used the word strangulation or strangled to define that. So if we had only asked, have you been strangled, yes or no, we'd be missing 30% of potential brain injury mechanism experiences from survivors. And then we also wanted to think about specific symptoms that would indicate a neurological issue or a potential brain injury. And 70% of survivors that we spoke to reported memory difficulties. And, this varied. This would be struggling to remember dates and times for appointments or getting them confused, struggling to remember days of working and shifts or where they needed to be, struggling to remember the names of voices of loved ones on the phone, difficulty recalling information, particularly for witness statements, and also thinking about being in like child protection meetings and being unable to remember and recall certain bits of information. And there was one lady who struggled with numbers, and that was part of her everyday work. So you start to see that there's a knock-on impact in multiple areas of life for survivors when they're struggling with memory difficulties. And we know that trauma can impact memory as well. So that can only be exacerbated if someone is living with a potential brain injury. 63% of the survivors we spoke to had trouble concentrating. So again, for a lot of people, this might be struggling to read a chapter of a book, listen to a song, listen to a podcast. But for a lot of people, it could be struggling to concentrate in meetings, whether those are meetings with service providers, whether those are meetings with the police, whether those are meetings with employers or within education. Across the board, 63% of women had trouble concentrating in a significant way. And 33% of women that we spoke to experienced speech challenges. And this is quite interesting because this is very clearly an indicator of a neurological issue where concentration and memory can be associated with trauma as well, as I said before. And women struggled with speech challenges in a variety of ways. So some women struggled to place words in sentences. Some women stuttered over their words in a way that they hadn't prior to their injury. Some women slurred their words, again, in a way that they hadn't prior to their injury. And I just want you to take a second to think of if you're working with someone who has had a history of substance use, and suddenly they present in a way where they're slurring their words. Quite often there will be assumptions made about the way that they communicate and the way that they engage, and the assumption will be that they're under the influence of a substance. And that may be true, but it also may be because they've experienced potentially a stroke, or any other neurological issue because of the physical violence that they've experienced. Maybe they've not been given appropriate or timely medical care, as you can understand the barriers to that. So just thinking about when people present with those speech challenges. We found that the women in our study who screened positive, so those 1 in 2 survivors, screened positive for history indicative of brain injury, were more likely to experience moderate to severe post-concussion symptoms, 4.5 times more likely. They were also more likely to experience low mood and post-traumatic stress. They also consistently reported a range of cognitive, emotional, and physical symptoms of brain injury. And I'm just going to show you a short video. This is a clip from our national media campaign last year where we worked with ITV News to get a story out in 11 different regions of the UK. And it's a really powerful reminder of the real life impact of brain injury in domestic abuse. So the clip that I'm going to play is the voice of a survivor, but it's being voiced over by an actor. Now, of course, not every head injury will result in a brain injury, as I said before, and some of the symptoms spoken about in this clip may also be related to trauma and mental health, connected to the experiences of abuse. But this next slide I'm about to show you will explain why brain injury needs to be considered for people who've experienced physical abuse, particularly to the head, neck, and face, and particularly for those who have a prolonged history of exposure and cumulative experiences of violence. So this Venn diagram highlights the complexity of symptomatic expressions for individuals who may have depression, be living with a brain injury, and experiencing post-traumatic stress. So you can see here in the middle, the crossover is fatigue, depressed mood, memory difficulties, poor concentration, and anxiety. And I just want you to take a second to think about the amount of people that you may have worked with or supported that may have presented with these symptoms or disclosed these symptoms, that may never have been asked about a head injury and may not have known to have mentioned it. And I also want to draw your attention to the overlap of brain injury and depression. So even outside of experiences of domestic abuse and trauma in that sense, there's a really high comorbidity of depression and brain injury, that lead to really heightened levels of mental health crises, heightened levels of suicidality and suicidal thoughts for people that are living with a brain injury and have depression. And may experience that depression for the first time after they've experienced their brain injury. And then to bring that back into the domestic abuse context, we've been in a lot of spaces where we're starting to talk about domestic abuse related deaths and how suicide connects into a lot of these incidents for survivors. And how brain injury could be a part of many of those people's experiences that isn't being understood. And that's something that we're working on. You know, we've attended the Westminster debates, the Parliament debates, talking about domestic abuse related deaths and suicide. And we've made sure that brain injury is mentioned in all the briefing papers because we do believe that there is a connection that has to be understood so survivors are supported and get the help they need. And as I said before, the majority of the women in our study endorsed moderate to severe anxiety, low mood, and post-traumatic stress symptoms. The majority of those women also reported cognitive symptoms, so problems with memory, slowed information processing, and difficulty concentrating. The complexity of symptoms and experiences suggests that interventions and support that are being put in place that might be the correct interventions might not be fully meeting the needs of individuals if brain injury isn't being considered as a health outcome after physical abuse. So as an organisation, you know, we did this research, we've done these media campaigns, we really want to raise awareness of brain injury in the context of domestic abuse, but we also want to make sure that we're bridging the gap of where resources and awareness are needed. So we held a focus group, one with survivors and one with professionals back in 2023. So when we had our findings, but before we had launched our report, because we wanted to understand what survivors felt were the right and correct next steps. So survivors said to us, the next best steps would be to have access to easy to understand and clear information about brain injury that would enable people to self-advocate, that there's a need for consistency and support when people are accessing services and treatments, and as such, training for professionals is needed to better understand the connections between domestic abuse and brain injury. And it's important for people to feel not only heard, but understood and supported when disclosing and seeking help regarding domestic abuse and brain injury. So participants spoke to us about the importance of raising awareness of brain injury amongst people who have experienced domestic abuse, with one survivor in one of our focus groups saying she thought she had dementia or was going through the menopause before it was identified that she'd actually experienced a brain injury. All the women we spoke with agreed that being provided with information that allows you to advocate for yourself is key to regaining control over your life. Women spoke about being able to access resources to understand more about brain injury and the symptoms they might be experiencing, alongside information about how to get support via a GP or other services. Women in our focus groups also talked about the importance of timing of the support and how allowing them ownership over when and how they support was absolutely essential. And women who participated in our focus groups recommended that any tools or screening methods or resources developed would need to consider the really significant concerns people have regarding access and the potential for deliberate misuse of their personal details. That an anonymous resource would be preferred by survivors seeking advice and support for this reason. And participants also told us they were really worried about how, if they had a brain injury diagnosis, if it was listed on medical records, that information could be requested and made known to family, as well as civil and criminal courts, and weaponized against them. So this really reinforced to us that any tool we create for this space would have to be non-diagnostic. So then we also wanted to speak to professionals. What did they need? What did they understand? So again, we held a roundtable with professionals that had people from across many, many different sectors. And all of the professionals said that they would like to see the development of a brain injury screening and information toolbox that would be available to professionals and people experiencing domestic abuse, and to consider whether information could be provided online to help people identify if they might need further assessment, and that there was an importance of providing support after screening. So our research, our focus groups and our roundtable events highlighted a really limited awareness and lack of resources related to acquired brain injury amongst professionals and people who experience domestic abuse. But that's not anybody's fault. The message was clear: there is a gap in knowledge and resources, but people were eager to learn, people were eager to go on training and wanted to be able to support survivors with the knowledge of brain injury. Survivors told us they wanted tools that were trauma-informed, confidential, and non-diagnostic. Professionals asked for something practical to help them feel confident in recognising symptoms and tips for adapting their support. So we began doing some user testing and some research. So we came together as a Brainkind team with our clinical neuropsychologists, myself, and our policy and research lead. And we put together all of the information that people were telling us that they needed within a tool. We looked at the tools that already existed, took the best bits of those tools that we wanted, and put together a draft. And with this draft tool called Brainkind Adapt, we set out to capture the views and experiences of professionals working across the domestic abuse sector, to try and understand where and how this tool could be used to check symptoms of a brain injury and where it might have a place in a survivor's journey to awareness and recovery. So we interviewed 11 support workers from 8 domestic abuse services in the UK. We asked them about their understanding of brain injury as a potential consequence of domestic abuse and discussed how we could bring more awareness to this issue. We showed them the draft web tool. We asked them for their feedback on every single question, as well as for advice onto where to best place this tool in someone's recovery journey. They told us that the tool would be best used once a survivor's built up trust and rapport with a professional, once they're familiar with the service. They suggested that the colour scheme and the layout had to change. But all the interviewees said that they would use the tool with their clients and were really enthusiastic about it, and many expressed an interest in taking part in the pilot. So we listened to their feedback and we made changes to the tool. And then we launched our pilot in July to September of 2025, and we were supported by 30 practitioners from 9 different domestic abuse specialist services across England. And this included a specialist service for LGBT survivors. And during this 3-month pilot, we collected feedback from professionals before and after using the tool. We conducted in-depth calls with each member of staff from the service that had used it about their understanding of brain injury as a potential consequence of domestic abuse, and if this had changed before and after using Brainkind Adapt. We asked them how the tool was used, how they felt using the tool with people they were supporting, any concerns they had about using the resource in their service delivery, and anything they'd like to see change. I'm just going to show you some of the feedback that we received. So one service said it's improved their knowledge and ability to talk about this subject with their clients. In another service, and I really like this quote, they said, I think they were always concerned around areas that you don't feel expert in. However, I feel it has helped me be able to have these conversations. And that's exactly what we want. You know, you don't need to be a clinical neuropsychologist, a brain injury expert to be able to use Brainkind Adapt. We want people to be able to use it to have safe, structured, non-diagnostic, non-clinical conversations that become the starting point of an additional lens of how support work is delivered and how people receive care. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of Brainkind Adapt. So on the landing page, this is what you see. Brainkind Adapt, a tool to support people with lived experience of domestic abuse presenting with brain injury symptoms. It's been designed to help professionals working with survivors of domestic abuse to understand symptoms following head injury or non-fatal strangulation. It's for guidance purposes. It's not medical or diagnostic. So based on the user feedback, we amended the tool, the user interface, the color scheme, the layout. The previous version was purple and lime green. We amended how we explored symptoms because initially, and I'll show you in a second, we had one very long list of symptoms. Visually, it was too overwhelming. We've broken that down into separate sections. So it looks at cognitive, emotional and mental, and then physical health symptoms in different pages. And we also wanted to make sure that the language was really accessible and clear. So when you go on the website, and I'll share the link at the end of this presentation, there's the option to hide the page as well. This tool has been designed for professionals to use alongside survivors in their support sessions. So ideally sat next to each other, both looking at the laptop, the professional digital device, and going through the questions together. We haven't designed this, and we hope it wouldn't be used by a survivor alone, because it really does need to be used in conjunction with support. So the first page is around demographic information. And the reason we were asking about these particular demographic identities is it's really helpful for us to understand, are there particular groups of people who are having certain lived experiences that, again, might need more specialist research or more specialist resources created. But with all of these options, there is a prefer not to say. All of the data collected when using this tool is completely anonymous. So there's no way we could work out which individual survivor has filled in the form with a professional. So the demographic information. And then the first question that you get to ask is, have you ever had a serious blow to the head? And it's just a yes or no click button. And you can see underneath there's a for example button that just gives a bit more context as to what we mean by serious blow to the head. So, and going back to the very start of the presentation, this is thinking about potential traumatic brain injuries and one of those mechanisms in how that can occur. Then the second question is, have you ever been held in a way that you felt that you couldn't breathe? And again, this is a yes or no question. And again, we've got an explaining box at the bottom, a little explanation box, because we appreciate people might have been strangled, choked, suffocated, or smothered. They might not understand from that initial wording, and want to be able to understand that. Then the next question is around, have you ever lost consciousness as a result of a blow to the head or being held in a way that you felt that you couldn't breathe? And the reason that we ask this is a loss of consciousness is a really helpful indicator as to the potential severity of an injury someone has experienced. And again, it's got an explanation box just underneath. And then the fourth question on this, so these 4 questions are what we call the mini busy. This fourth question is, have you ever had an illness affecting your brain, yes or no? So if someone clicks yes, a text box appears with the option to enter about 100 characters. And in this text box, we would ask someone to write epilepsy, stroke, meningitis, etc. What is the illness, not how it was caused or who it was caused by. We don't need to know that individual information, but it's helpful for us to understand, is there a pattern of illnesses that people are being diagnosed with that have experienced domestic abuse and also might be living with a brain injury. And then, as I say, you go on to the symptom checker. So this initially was that one long list, but we've broken it up into 3 easier pages for people. And this asks, have any of these symptoms appeared for the first time or got worse since you had a blow to the head or were held in a way that you couldn't breathe? So bringing that context back to those potential brain injury mechanisms through the domestic abuse experiences. So here with these symptoms, you would literally click or tick the boxes that apply and click next, and then you'd get a second page thinking about emotional and mental health symptoms, then a third page thinking about cognitive symptoms. And this is just really helpful to break it down in this way so you can understand what people are struggling with or the symptoms that are bothering them. And then the tool self-populates with everything the survivor said yes to, and it asks you, of these previously selected symptoms, which 3 bother you the most? So again, you just tick the 3. And this is really helpful because it might be the first time that you as a practitioner are learning about these symptoms being an issue for this survivor. It might be the first time they've disclosed them. And in this moment, they're telling you the 3 that they really need the most help and support with. And then you have the option to go back and amend any of the answers that you've given. Because we appreciate, if you're maybe taking a break, like maybe a 10-minute break whilst you're doing this, and then you come back to it with a survivor, if they need a bit of time, they might want to revise the questions or go over them again. And this is the opportunity to do that. And you can go back and change any of the questions, and you won't have to refill everything out again. It will remember the answers that you've previously given that you've not amended. And then when you're happy with all of that, you click the complete button. Then the page comes up that is the final results and the thank you. So it says, thank you for using Brainkind Adapt. If the person you supported would like to understand more about their symptoms, we recommend that they take the response summary generated, and I'll show you an example in a second, by completing this tool with them to their GP to discuss the responses they gave. If you would like to understand more about how to adapt your practice to support the person who's completed Brainkind Adapt, please use the guidance booklet. And again, I'll show you a screen grab of that in a second. If you or the person you are supporting remains concerned about their symptoms, we recommend they seek medical advice, and we would anticipate that you would follow your normal safeguarding and medical advice procedures with the people that you support. Now, the important bit on this page is you need to click print or save as a PDF, because this is how the survivor summary sheet is generated. So this is the response sheet that a survivor would get. So it says, thank you for using Brainkind Adapt, a web tool designed for professionals supporting survivors of domestic abuse to help them understand more about the symptoms experienced following a head injury or non-fatal strangulation. If you would like to understand more about your symptoms, we recommend that you take this information sheet with you to your GP. It can also be taken to anyone else, any professional that is supporting the survivor if they want to share that with them. Some people have said that they want to take it to their employer or their place of education to have some support and some accommodations, and that's completely fine. It is up to the survivor, once they've got the sheet of paper, who sees it, when and why. But you can see here it lists the responses. So every response that someone has given throughout the study. So have you ever had a serious blow to the head? Yes. Have you ever been held in a way that you couldn't breathe? Yes. So all of those potential brain injury mechanisms, if they've had a loss of consciousness, if they've had a previously diagnosed illness affecting the brain. But then it also helpfully lists all of the symptoms that people have experienced and the 3 that bother them the most. And this is really helpful because survivors said to us they wanted something that they could take to a medical professional as and when they wanted to. They wanted it to be anonymous, so it doesn't have a name or a date on it, doesn't say which service you've used this with. But they also wanted to be able to have something that if they did go to the GP, they wouldn't have to remember everything. And if they're struggling with memory and concentration, this is something that helps bridge that gap of sharing that information. They also said they struggle with retelling everything that's happened to them. So this helps explain, I've experienced domestic abuse. I'm worried I might have experienced a brain injury because I've experienced a head injury. These are my symptoms and this is what I'm struggling with the most. And it really starts that conversation for them in a way that perhaps they wouldn't have been able to before. So the way, as I say, you access this, I'll just go back to the previous slide, you need to click print or save as a PDF. Now, how you provide that summary sheet to the survivor would be a conversation between you and them, thinking about what is the safest and most appropriate way to give them a document. So for some people, it's safe for it to be an email, but for some people, they prefer that you print it and give them that physical paper copy, and maybe save a copy on a client file that they've got with you in case they need a second print off. So just be aware that you will need to have that conversation about what best fits that survivor. And then there's a little guidance booklet, and I say little because it's only 8 pages long, because we've tried to make it easy to read and accessible. You don't need War and Peace. No one's got time to read a 200-page booklet on all the different brain injury symptoms, how they present, and all the different ways you can help people. So this breaks down into thinking about cognitive difficulties, emotional difficulties, and physical difficulties, those 3 categories that the symptoms are broken down to. But you can see here the screen grab. This is thinking about this page, planning and organizational challenges. So on the left-hand column are some of the ways that people might be having problems. They might have some issues, they might be struggling with some things. And on the right, and a lot of people say, well, Steffi, these look like common sense, and because a lot of them are, but it's with that brain injury lens. On the right-hand side are some suggestions and ways that maybe you can adapt your practice as a professional, or you can suggest to that individual survivor maybe a way that you can develop a routine together, or put something in a plan, or ways that they can go away and try and see if it works for them. And this guidance booklet is available once you finish the tool. It's hyperlinked on this page. I'll go back to it so you can see. It's hyperlinked here. I don't know if you can see my cursor. That is a link to the guidance booklet. So you can click that and print save the PDF. But don't worry, if you want to just print save the PDF, you can also get this guidance booklet on the landing page of the website before you use the tool. And the reason we've put it there is we understand that there might be a lot of people that you're supporting that you think might have had these experiences, but for where they're at in their journey and with what's going on for them, within that day, that week, that month, it might not be the right time to use this tool. It might not be the safest time to use this tool, but you can still refer to this booklet and have a think about how you can adapt your practice without using the tool before you use it. So just want to give a bit of feedback. So this is a new slide that we've added recently. So this is a survivor story. So a survivor disclosed a recent seizure and presented with confusion, drowsiness, and head bruising. When the support worker used Brainkind Adapt, they explored the symptoms with her and the history of head trauma, and completed the questionnaire with their consent. So they completed Brainkind Adapt. And I've linked the article here if you would like to read specifically what the survivor and the service have said. But this is SafeNet up in Burnley, Preston, and Greater Manchester. But we really wanted to share this because we don't often get the feedback, because of obviously the tool is anonymous and we don't know the outcomes for people. But this is proof that Brainkind Adapt has empowered a survivor to understand her symptoms and seek help and advocate for a neurological assessment. It's helped identify the indicators of brain injury, helped her understand her symptoms and feel validated. It enabled her to share the screening results with her GP and request a neurological assessment. And because of that, she's now receiving the medical care that she needs. And I will caveat this with, not every survivor who has the symptoms and goes to the GP will necessarily get the response of getting a neurological referral or an assessment. And you might get an assessment and you might have all the tests done and a brain injury still might not show up. I just want to set expectations there. But this tool has helped this woman understand the symptoms she's experiencing, how they relate to the head injury, and it means going forward for her, the support and the structures in place will be better equipped to meet her needs. So we're incredibly grateful to SafeNet to sharing this example with us, and to giving consent to sharing this on the slide. And I also want to share, this is a bit of an exclusive about what the Brainkind Adapt is telling us so far. So since we launched in November last year, we've had 111 uses of the tool, which is absolutely incredible. Because, not every survivor that you're supporting will need to use this tool. It might not be appropriate for everyone, but 111 people have had it used so far. And what it's showing us so far is that 65% of people have experienced a serious blow to the head in this. 71% have been held in a way that they felt they couldn't breathe. 47% of people have experienced a loss of consciousness. 20% of people had a pre-existing illness, so a diagnosed illness affecting the brain. And again, really high rates of memory difficulties, trouble concentrating, and similar levels to Brainkind, too many to count, looking at speech challenges as well. And a lot of people ask me, what are the top 3 symptoms? So far, out of 111 people, the symptoms bothering people the most relate to sleep problems, poor memory, and headaches. So it's a little bit of food for thought there on what the results are showing us so far. And obviously, the tool is ongoing. But I just wanted to share with you not only the success story, but the sort of signs and symptoms that are coming out of the tool. So just to recap, Brainkind Adapt is completely free to use. You don't have to pay to access this as a service. There is no registration or password required to access this. It's an anonymous data collection. So we only see the questions that people have said, yes, no, and the symptoms. We don't know who uses it, what service, or when. And it's been made for all professionals working with survivors of domestic abuse. So obviously we developed this with domestic abuse professionals, but if you work in any other profession where you work with survivors of domestic abuse and you think this might be a good fit, you can absolutely use this tool. We would really encourage that. And what Brainkind Adapt includes is 4 questions from the Brain Injury Screening Index, so as I say, the mini busy, an exploration of symptoms, looking at what survivors are experiencing, a personalised summary of responses for the survivor to take to their GP or any other appropriate service or support, and a guidance booklet for professionals to adapt their support. And now I will be showing all of the slides after this presentation. Obviously, you can revisit this video once it's recorded, but you can also use the link there or use the QR code to access Brainkind Adapt. So whatever best works for you. So I just want to say thank you. And if you've got any questions, obviously my email is here. Please do get in touch. I'm going to stop sharing my slides in a moment. And I know that we've got the Q&A function. So please do pop any questions that you've got in there. Just a reminder, I can't answer individual case studies. And I don't have a clinical background, I should add. But if there are clinically based questions, I can take that back to the psychologist in our team and feed that back. But thank you so much for your attention and your energy. We're really, really proud to be able to share this information and to get more awareness of brain injury in the context of domestic abuse. So just to remind you, our study found that 1 in 2 survivors could be living with a brain injury, and that varies in how that presents. A lot of the symptoms overlap with trauma and mental health, and we've created this absolutely free resource, and we've taken a year and a half to develop it. It's tried and tested to make sure it's an appropriate fit and it works for people. So I'll stop sharing my screen now and happy to answer any questions that there are. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that, Steffi. It's really interesting, and some couple of comments in the chat about really liking the tool and been looking for this exact tool. So so that's really good to hear. We've got one question so far in the chat, but you did touch on it, I think, when you were talking about the example, the feedback that you'd had from Brain Adapt. So, the question asks, when we say brain injury, is this something that would be seen on a CT scan or an MRI, or are these injuries / symptoms that can happen without being visible on a scan?
That's a great question, and brain injuries present in a whole different manner of ways. It depends on how the injury has been caused, the severity of that injury. But as I was just saying before, not all brain injuries show up on scans. There's not one size fits all test. I know that there's a lot of conversations in the brain injury world talking about blood biomarkers, but I think we're a long way off having that sort of science readily available. So at the moment, no, they don't all readily show up on scans, which is why we've really tried to focus on the signs and symptoms within Brainkind Adapt and not so much the diagnosis, because diagnosis might not be possible for everybody and it might not bring the results and the support that everybody needs. But understanding that they may have experienced a brain injury because of that head injury or being held in a way they couldn't breathe, those symptoms are the bit that need to be addressed first and foremost for people. At least that's what survivors have told us, and that's, we want to be survivor led with that. But no, you're absolutely right. Not everything will show up on a scan, which makes it so tricky, when we're thinking about this for people who are accessing support.
Thank you, Steffi. We haven't actually got any other questions that have come in yet, so I'll just give it a couple of minutes. I've just put another message in the chat just to ask people. I know you've kindly provided your email at the end of the slides as well, so it may be that people have questions following the session. But I'll just give it just a couple of minutes just to see if anyone else has got anything. Yeah, you've got some comments in the chat box just saying thank you and how clear the presentation was. So.
Thank you. I can just see in the chat box about question 2. So I'm loading the tool on my other screen and I'm just triple checking because we have recently made some amendments. So I'm just going through to make sure I don't get stuck on question 2.
Oh, thank you. And then, yeah, we have got another question that's just come in as well. So I'll let you do that and then I'll read.
Yeah, so I can see Sarah, I've just triple checked my end using the Brainkind Adapt link and I can get past question 2. So it might be you need to give it another go. So just try triple clicking the next button. But if you do have further issues, obviously, please do flag them up to me. I'm not the techie person. We've got a wonderful web development team who've created the coding for this tool. But thank you for flagging that. But yes, ready for the next question.
Next question. Okay, so it's the next question says, are there differences in the ways we should screen / discuss with survivors depending on their age group when they had the hits to the head when they experienced the head injury?
Okay, that's a really great question. So am I right to assume that you mean so everyone's experienced domestic abuse and you're thinking about the difference in ages? Can you just clarify or whether you mean other hits to the head that someone might have experienced? Because if it is everyone who's experienced domestic abuse, regardless of age, yeah, I would ask the questions in the same way. I would just, I don't want to tell you how to do your jobs because you already do amazing work with the people that you support, and I would just have the conversations in the way that you ordinarily do when you're thinking about medical issues or safeguarding concerns. Approach it with that same level of care, and it might be a case of when you ask, have you ever had a serious blow to the head, looking at that explainer box and talking round those words a bit more, because one thing that we found is there's not one word or one phrase that everyone resonates with when they talk about injuries to the head, neck and face. And you might want to describe it like that. You might want to say, have you ever been hit or hurt in the head, neck or face? That's fine. You can ask the question in that way. It's just thinking about what best fits for the person that you're supporting. Does it present differently? That I would have to go back and check with our clinical neuropsychologist, because that's a bit of a medical clinical question. To the best of my knowledge, no. But Sydney, if you can share your contact details with our host today, then I can absolutely follow that up. Be happy to do that. But to the best of my knowledge, no. But there is a gender sex-based difference. So typically men and women present differently post-stroke or post-traumatic brain injury. So particularly for women, and this is why we mention it on the slides, a lot of those signs and symptoms come up as mental health and trauma for women, which when you've already got a lived experience of trauma, you can understand makes it even more complicated. But brilliant question, and not one I've had before, so thank you. It's always nice to get a new question. Oh, thank you everyone so much for the comments. It's really, really lovely. And we took a really long time doing the research, but then also speaking with survivors and professionals and developing the tool, because we want to make sure we get it right. And we know that, we might need to make amendments to the tool as maybe our language evolves and how we think about brain injury. But we knew that there really needed to be a resource, but it had to fit, we didn't want to just put loads of really clinical medical questions on a form online and suddenly people go, well, actually, we can't have conversations with people using that, or we feel really nervous about there being a threshold score, for example, and using a tool. So it's been made with a lot of love and care and time, and it's really lovely to see that so many people think it's great and could be a useful resource. I would just say, once you've got the slides and once you've had a look at Brainkind Adapt and you've thought about it, using it in your services, please do share it with the people that you work with too, your other colleagues who maybe couldn't make the call today. Because one conversation could change a life, and I really do believe that in thinking about brain injury and domestic abuse, because for the longest time, before we did our too many to count research, there was no study like this in the UK. We could look at international numbers, but we didn't know the prevalence in England and Wales. And now that we know it could be as many as 1 in 2 survivors, those conversations are absolutely crucial. So thank you.